The journey you are about to hear is one of great distance, time, and adventure. It is the tale of Odysseus, a man whose name echoes through the halls of history and mythology. Yet, as you listen, imagine that these words are not only a story, but a slow, peaceful descent into a restful space, preparing you for a night of calm reflection and relaxation. In this quiet moment, let us leave behind the noise of the day and the endless rushing of the world. We enter a different time, a different place, an ancient Greece where the gods still walked among mortals, where battles were fought and heroes made their mark upon the world. And in this world, a single man embarks on a journey like no other, the journey of a lifetime. But before we begin, take a deep breath. Allow your body to settle and your mind to quiet. Let the words wash over you as gently as the waves kiss the dew. Shore of the islands Odysseus once sailed. His story is not just one of wars, gods, and monsters, but also of loss, longing, and the quiet yearning for home. In a way, it mirrors something within each of us, the quiet desire to return to something familiar, to find peace after long struggles. This, after all, is where our journey begins, with the end of a war. The Great War of Troy, which has raged for years, is finally over. The Greeks have emerged victorious, but with victory comes not the joy of celebration, but an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. The war that has consumed so much of Odysseus's life leaves him tired, heart-heavy, and only partially satisfied. The greatest prize has been won, but it is not a treasure chest of gold or silver that he seeks. No, Odysseus longs for something much simpler, something much closer to the heart. He yearns to return home to Ithaca, to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. Yet, this longing will not come easily. The gods, fickle and capricious as they are, will soon weave a complex web of trials and tribulations that will delay Odysseus's return for years. What begins as a journey home will turn into an odyssey, one full of wonder and peril, but also full of moments of great beauty and unexpected wisdom. Now, let us take a step back and breathe. We find ourselves, like Odysseus, standing at the edge of something great, his journey home, our journey into sleep. Both require patience. Both are filled with moments of quiet contemplation. So, as you settle further into this moment, imagine yourself on the shores of Ithaca, watching the horizon, waiting for the first glimmer of home. With each breath, feel yourself draw closer to the warmth and comfort of that place, just as Odysseus does in his heart. And as we move forward, know that this journey will unfold at a pace that allows you to relax, to absorb each moment, and to let go of the tension of the day. The path ahead may be long, but it will be taken slowly and gently, just as it should be. There's no rush, no urgency. Only the steady, calming rhythm of the waves and the story of Odysseus, whose heart, like yours, is in search of something deeper, something eternal, peace. So as the story begins, I invite you to let your mind wander. Follow the course of Odysseus's journey as it twists and turns, as he faces challenges that test him, not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually. In the same way, we too face moments of trial and challenge in our lives. Yet, just as Odysseus finds a way through, so too will we find our way through, inch by inch, step by step. Each small victory, each moment of rest, brings us closer to the peace we seek. Let us now turn quietly to the beginning of Odysseus's great adventure. His departure from Troy. The fire of battle has faded, and the path before him is unknown. But there is no fear in his heart, only the quiet resolve to return to the arms of his family. This is a journey he must make alone, though, surrounded by his loyal companions, it will not be easy. The sea, vast and unpredictable, will soon become his greatest adversary. But for now, as we begin, imagine yourself walking with Odysseus, leaving behind the ashes of Troy and setting sail toward a distant horizon. There is peace in that first step, the calm of knowing that each movement forward, no matter how small, is a step closer to home. Feel that peace now as we begin, not with excitement or urgency, but with a quiet, steady rhythm. The time has come to turn our attention to the events that set this long and arduous journey in motion. The Great Trojan War. It was a war that lasted 10 years, a war that consumed countless lives and tested the strength of men and gods alike. Yet, for all its grandeur, its victories and defeats, it is the quiet aftermath that we focus on now. The war is over. The Greek forces have won. But at what cost? The heroes of this war, like Odysseus, find themselves standing in a world far different from the one they left. For Odysseus, the triumph of Troy is no cause for celebration. The clamor of battle, the roar of the crowd, the triumph of victory, all of it feels distant, like a faint echo reverberating across time. For a moment, it all seems so irrelevant. He is weary, his heart heavy with the weight of what was lost and what lies ahead. Odysseus had been one of the leaders of the Greek army, famed for his cunning and wisdom. His intellect had played a pivotal role in the war's final outcome, the creation of the Trojan horse, that clever ruse that allowed the Greeks to infiltrate Troy and claim victory. But for Odysseus, this victory had come at a cost. The years of fighting, the lives lost, the sacrifices made, they all felt like empty victories in the face of the quiet longing he felt inside. He thought of Ithaca, his home, of the rolling hills, and the familiar sound of the waves breaking against the shore. He thought of Penelope, his wife, who waited for him, and of his son, Telemachus, who was growing up without him. These were the thoughts that filled his mind as the smoke of battle cleared and the aftermath of the war settled in Dot as he stood. There, looking out over the city of Troy, Odysseus was not filled with pride, but with a deep yearning. His soul longed for the peace of home. The war was over, but it had not brought the sense of completion he had expected. It only left him with the unshakable realization that no, victory could fill the emptiness inside him. Home, that was what he sought. It was not the grandeur of Troy, nor the spoils of war, but the quiet refuge of his family and his homeland that he longed for. His men, too, were weary. They had fought hard, endured great hardship, and were now ready to return to their families. But, as with Odysseus, the sea, that vast, endless expanse, would soon become their greatest adversary. It was not an enemy they could face with swords or shields, but with patience, with endurance. The journey home would not be quick. It would take many years, and it would not be without peril. And so, Odysseus and his men set sail from Troy, leaving behind the ruins of the great city, the echoes of their victory fading into the distance. The sea stretched out before them, vast and unknown. In those first moments of the journey, there was no excitement, no joy, just a quiet acceptance of what lay ahead. They were weary, unsure, and filled with a longing for home. The wind was calm at first, the sea still. The sails billowed gently in the breeze, and the rhythmic sound of the waves lapping against the sides of the ship became a steady, soothing lullaby. There was no shouting, no frantic hurry, just the quiet, peaceful rhythm of the sea as it carried them further and further from Troy. Odysseus, standing at the helm, looked out over the waters, his thoughts far away. He was not thinking of the battles fought or the glory of the victory. He was thinking of home, of Penelope's smile, of the soft touch of her hand, of the warmth of their hearth. That in that moment, it was as though time itself slowed down. The days stretched out before him, each one blending into the next, a slow, peaceful journey across the endless sea. The weight of the war seemed to fade as the sea carried them farther from the land of conflict. But with this distance came the realization that there was no quick path to Ithaca. The journey would be long and full of challenges that would test both their endurance and their resolve. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the men aboard Odysseus's ship began to feel the weight of the journey. The sea, though calm, began to wear on their spirits. The lack of land, the endless horizon, these things, which had once seemed so peaceful, now felt oppressive. The men began to murmur amongst themselves. They longed for the comforts of home, for the certainty of familiar shores. But Odysseus, ever the leader, remained focused. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, a quiet determination in his heart. He knew that they were not yet halfway to Ithaca, and that the journey ahead would be filled with unknown challenges. And yet, in the quiet of the sea, amidst the murmurs of his men, Odysseus knew one thing. They had no choice but to continue. The only way forward was through Dot as the ship sailed on. The first of many challenges loomed on the horizon, the island of the Lotus Eaters. It was here, on this quiet, peaceful island, that the men would first encounter the dangers of their journey. For though the island appeared tranquil and inviting, it held within it a deadly temptation. The Lotus Eaters were a people who lived in a dreamlike state, their minds dulled by the intoxicating effects of the lotus flower. It was said that anyone who ate the lotus would forget everything, everything about their journey, their home, their loved ones. The man who ate the lotus would become content to stay, forever drifting in a fog of peaceful forgetfulness. Odysseus, with his wisdom and foresight, quickly realized the danger the island posed. He ordered his men to remain on the ship, warning them not to let the lure of the lotus take hold of them. But temptation is a powerful thing. Some of Odysseus's men, unable to resist, ventured onto the island. They tasted the lotus, and their minds were immediately clouded. They forgot everything. Their longing for home, their memories of their families, all of it faded away. They no longer cared about returning to Ithaca. They only cared about staying on the island, lost in the blissful fog of the lotus flower. Odysseus, filled with both frustration and sadness, realized the danger they now faced. He was forced to drag his men back to the ship, each of them fighting against the pull of the lotus's sweet seduction. With great effort, he got them back aboard the ship, and they sailed away, leaving the island behind. But the image of the lotus eaters, with their blissful, forgotten state, remained in Odysseus's mind. In those moments, as they sailed away from the island, Odysseus felt a deep sense of loss. It was not just the men who had tasted the lotus and forgotten their homes, but something within him as well. He, too, at times, wished for the peace that came with forgetting, the peace that came from not having to worry about the journey, about the dangers ahead. But he knew that this peace was only an illusion. The real peace, the one he longed for, could only be found in the return home. It was a peace that required patience, perseverance, and above all, remembrance. The island of the lotus eaters was but the first of many challenges Odysseus and his men would face on their long journey home. But with each challenge, Odysseus learned more about himself and his crew. Each trial brought them closer to understanding the true meaning of home and the price of peace. And so, the journey continued, the ship sailing on through the endless sea, each wave carrying them farther from Troy and closer to Ithaca. The journey was long, but with every passing day, Odysseus felt a little closer to his home, even if it remained just beyond the horizon. As the ship sailed further into the vast, seemingly endless sea, the journey began to take its toll on Odysseus and his men. The calm waves, once soothing and peaceful, slowly transformed into a reminder of the passage of time and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The men, though seasoned warriors, found themselves drifting into a silent contemplation of their circumstances. The world of Troy, with its noise and chaos, was far behind them, and now they were alone on the sea, with nothing but the vast sky and the ever-moving waters stretching out in front of them. For Odysseus, this was not the joyous homecoming he had envisioned. There were no triumphal celebrations, no warm embraces waiting for him in Ithaca. Instead, the empty sea was his only companion, and with each passing day, the distance from his family seemed to grow. His heart ached as he thought of Penelope, the wife who had waited for him through the long years of war. He thought of Telemachus, his son, who was growing up without his father. These thoughts, once filled with hope, now carried a heavy weight, and they settled like stones in his heart. Yet, despite the sorrow that clung to him, Odysseus was a man of resolve. He understood that the journey home would not be quick. It would be a long road, filled with challenges that would test both his physical strength and his mental fortitude. But he also knew that there was no turning back. The only way forward was to face whatever lay ahead, to navigate the dangers of the sea, and to survive the trials that awaited them. The sea, in its quiet vastness, had a way of making men feel small. It was as though the waters stretched on, forever, a vast emptiness that swallowed up the sense of time and place. The once lively conversations among the crew had now turned to silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the waves as they gently rocked the ship. Even the sails, once billowing with the wind, now hung limp and still, as if the journey itself had become weary dot. As they sailed, Odysseus took to walking the deck in the quiet hours of the night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft, silver light over the water. The air was cool, and the faint scent of salt filled his lungs. He looked out at the horizon, but there was nothing to see, just the endless stretch of water, the dark expanse that seemed to go on forever. In these quiet moments, Odysseus would often think of home. He would close his eyes and imagine the feel of the earth beneath his feet, the familiar warmth of the sun as it set over Ithaca. He could almost hear the sounds of his wife's laughter, the sound of Telemachus playing in the distance. These thoughts were a balm for his weary soul, a reminder of the purpose that drove him forward. But as the days stretched on, the journey grew more uncertain. The vastness of the sea began to feel oppressive, and the men began to feel the weight of their long voyage. There were no landmarks to guide them, no signs to show them they were on the right path. Only the waves, relentless and unchanging, stretching before them in every direction. It was then that the first real danger of the journey emerged. The island of the Lotus Eaters. The island appeared unexpectedly on the horizon, a small, seemingly peaceful place that beckoned them in. From a distance, it looked like a paradise. The shoreline was dotted with lush green trees, and the scent of flowers lingered in the air. The men, tired and weary from the endless sea, saw the island as a promise of rest, a chance to escape the long journey for just a moment. Odysseus, though weary, was a man of caution. He ordered his men to anchor the ship off the coast, but to remain wary of what might lie within. As they approached the shore, the men were greeted by a gentle breeze, the soft rustling of leaves, and the peaceful sounds of the island. It was almost too perfect, too calm. They made their way inland, their feet sinking into the soft earth as they walked through a dense forest. The trees towered overhead, their leaves swaying gently in the breeze. The air was warm, thick with the fragrance of flowers that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy perfume. It was an inviting place, a place that promised respite from the exhausting journey they had endured. It wasn't long before they encountered the inhabitants of the island, the Lotus Eaters. These people were unlike any the men had met before. They were serene, peaceful, and entirely absorbed in their own world. The Lotus Eaters offered the men the fruit of the lotus flower, a delicate white blossom that seemed to shimmer in the light. The men, tired and desperate for any form of comfort, accepted the gift with little hesitation. The moment they consumed the lotus, something strange began to happen. A fog seemed to descend upon their minds, clouding their thoughts. The worries, the fears, the longing for home, all of it faded into the background, replaced by a sense of deep, unshakable peace. It was as though the lotus had erased their memories, had wiped away their desire to continue the journey. They were content to stay on the island forever. Lost in the comforting haze of the lotus flower, Odysseus, realizing the danger, rushed to the men who had partaken of the lotus. They were no longer the men who had sailed with him from Troy. Their eyes were glazed, their bodies relaxed, and their minds were far from the journey ahead. The ship, the sea, Ithaca, it all seemed so distant to them now. All they wanted was to stay on the island, to forget about their responsibilities and their long journey home. Odysseus knew he had to act quickly. He dragged the men back to the ship, forcing them to leave the island and return to the ship before they could be completely consumed by the lotus's hold. But even as they sailed away, Odysseus could feel the pull of the lotus in his own heart. He too for a moment wished to stay in that peaceful fog, to forget the pain of the journey and the weight of the years spent in war. But he knew that this peace was an illusion, a trap, and so, with great effort, Odysseus and his men sailed away from the island, leaving the lotus eaters and their intoxicating flower behind. As the ship sailed back out to sea, Odysseus couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. The island had promised peace, but it was a peace that came at the cost of forgetting everything. It was a peace that was not meant to last. True peace, Odysseus knew, could only be found in returning home, in the quiet embrace of family, in the familiar shores of Ithaca. But for now, the journey continued, and the sea stretched on before them, as vast and mysterious as ever. The horizon remained just out of reach, but Odysseus's heart still held on to hope. Somewhere beyond the endless expanse of water, Ithaca awaited, and with each passing day he would sail toward it, knowing that, no matter how long the journey took, no matter how many dangers lay ahead, the promise of home was worth the struggle. The sea had been both friend and foe to Odysseus, but nothing compared to the first true test of his journey, the encounter with Polyphemus, the Cyclops. After leaving the island of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus and his men set sail, determined to continue their journey toward home. Yet the vast expanse of the sea offered no guarantees, only uncertainty. There were no familiar landmarks to guide them, and each wave that crashed against the ship seemed to carry with it a whisper of something dangerous, something unknown. As the days passed, a new land came into view on the horizon. The island appeared to be wild, untamed, its cliffs sharp and jagged against the sky, its shores lined with towering trees. The men were cautious as they approached, but the sight of the island piqued their curiosity. Odysseus, ever the leader, decided to explore the island and see what lay within. Perhaps there was shelter to be found, or a source of food to ease their hunger. The men made their way ashore, their feet sinking into the soft earth, their eyes scanning the wild landscape for signs of life. The island seemed to be devoid of human inhabitants, but there were clear signs that someone or something had been there before. There were footprints in the sand, large and deep, as though they belonged to a creature far larger than any man. The men, uneasy but intrigued, pressed on Dot. It wasn't long before they discovered the cave. The entrance was hidden among the thick trees, barely visible to the naked eye. As they approached, they noticed the tracks leading inside. Odysseus, with his ever-curious mind, led the way, urging his men to follow him. They entered the cave cautiously, unsure of what they might find. Inside, the cave was vast and shadowy, with the faint scent of firewood lingering in the air. At first, it appeared abandoned, but there was a large stone hearth in the center of the room, and the remnants of a fire smoldered at its heart. The men made themselves comfortable, believing they had found refuge. They sat down, weary from the journey, and began to prepare a small meal, grateful for the chance to rest and eat. But their peaceful moment was soon interrupted. From the shadows of the cave, there came a low, rumbling noise like the shifting of stones. The ground trembled beneath them, and then the entrance to the cave was blocked by a massive figure, a Cyclops, Polyphemus, as Odysseus and his men quickly realized, was no ordinary creature. He was a giant with a towering frame and a single bloodshot eye in the center of his forehead. His body was covered in thick matted hair, and his arms were as large as tree trunks. He moved with a slow, lumbering gait, each step shaking the earth beneath him. His presence filled the cave, casting an oppressive shadow over the men. The Cyclops spoke in a deep, guttural voice that echoed through the cave, his words strange and foreign to Odysseus's ears. It was clear that he was not accustomed to the presence of strangers. Polyphemus was a solitary creature, living alone on the island, far from the reach of the gods and men. He had no need for companionship, no desire for guests. Odysseus ever. The diplomat stepped forward, attempting to speak in a tone of respect and peace. He introduced himself and his men, explaining that they had come seeking shelter and food after a long journey. He offered the Cyclops a gift, as was customary in the lands of the gods. "We come in peace," Odysseus said, his voice calm yet firm. "We have no ill intentions. We are simply travelers in need of rest." But Polyphemus, with his uncaring nature and singular focus on his own existence, was unmoved by the offer. He scoffed at Odysseus's words, sneering at the idea of hospitality. Without hesitation, the Cyclops seized 2 of Odysseus's men, dragging them away to the farthest corner of the cave. The men screamed in terror, but it was to no avail. Polyphemus devoured them with a horrifying brutality, his monstrous jaws crushing their bodies in an instant. Odysseus watched in helpless horror, the reality of their situation sinking in. They were trapped. They had no way of escaping the cave, and the Cyclops, with his immense strength, was an unstoppable force. The rest of the men cowered in fear, realizing that the peaceful rest they had sought had turned into a nightmare. But Odysseus, ever resourceful, refused to give up. He knew that if they were to survive, they would need to outwit the Cyclops. There was no force that could match the strength of Polyphemus, but there was one thing that Odysseus possessed: his cunning. He quickly devised a plan. He instructed his men to gather a large portion of the Cyclops' food, a few barrels of wind, to hide it in the corner of the cave. When Polyphemus returned later that day, Odysseus offered the Cyclops the wine as a gift. "You are a mighty creature," he said, "and we, mere mortals, wish to honor your strength." He poured the wine into the Cyclops' cup, urging him to drink and rest. Polyphemus, already weary from the hunt and delighted by the sweet, intoxicating wine, drank deeply. The wine flowed in the Cyclops' veins, and soon he was overcome by a deep drowsiness. He lay down, his massive body slumping against the stone floor of the cave. With the Cyclops unconscious, Odysseus and his men set to work. They took a large, sharp stake, one of the pieces of wood they had used to prop up their ship, and began to sharpen it. They heated it in the fire until it glowed red-hot, and then, with great effort, they plunged it into Polyphemus's single eye. The Cyclops screamed in agony, his massive body writhing in pain as the hot metal seared into his flesh. But even in his pain, Polyphemus was not defeated. His fury grew, and he bellowed out in rage, but the wine had made him slow and disoriented. Odysseus and his men seized the opportunity and ran for the entrance to the cave. As they fled, Polyphemus stumbled blindly in pursuit, his mind clouded by the pain and the effects of the wine. His cries echoed across the island, waking the other Cyclopes who lived in the nearby caves. But despite their presence, the men had managed to escape. They scrambled back to the ship, panting with exhaustion and fear. Yet even in their victory, Odysseus's sense of triumph was tainted by one fatal mistake. Before they left the island, he called back to the Cyclops, taunting him with his name. "I am Odysseus," he yelled, "the man who blinded you, the man who bested you." Polyphemus, though blinded and in pain, heard this, and in his fury he cursed Odysseus. The curse would follow the hero for the rest of his journey, a bitter reminder of the consequences of hubris. As the ship sailed away, Odysseus's men were filled with a mix of relief and regret. They had survived, but at what cost? The island, once a place of hope, had now become a dark memory. And though they had escaped, the curse of Polyphemus would follow them, haunting their every step. The days drifted by, each wave rolling toward them like a slow march of time, each gust of wind carrying them further from the shores of the Cyclops' island, but closer to an even greater danger. The sea, with its deep blue expanse and endless horizon, offered no rest, no reprieve. And it was on the boundless waters that Odysseus and his crew would soon encounter their most perilous trial yet: the sirens and the twin monsters of the deep, Scylla and Charybdis. The men sailed on, their spirits fluctuating between weariness and a glimmer of hope. They had survived the Cyclops, but the gods had made it clear that the trials of their journey were far from over. The wind was still against them, the sea still vast, but it was in the silence of the night that they would face their next test. It began with the song. The sirens, creatures of both beauty and death, had a way of weaving their voices into the very fabric of the sea. They were alluring, seductive, their melodies carried by the wind, calling out to any sailors who dared to venture too close. And for those who heard their call, the fate was sealed. The sirens' songs were said to be so sweet, so enchanting, that they could cause men to forget everything, their families, their homes, their very will to survive. The sailors would be drawn toward the sound, their ships crashing into the jagged rocks beneath the waves, the water swallowing them whole. Odysseus, knowing the danger of these creatures and determined to keep his men alive, had prepared. He had been warned by the gods, specifically Circe, who had told him of the dangers ahead. "You will hear their songs," she had said, "and you will be tempted, but you must not listen. There is only one way to survive." And so Odysseus gave his orders. He had his men block their ears with beeswax, ensuring that they could not hear the sweet, tempting melodies. But for himself, he left his ears open, desiring to hear their songs, for he knew that no man who heard the sirens could resist their call. He, more than anyone, wanted to understand what it was about their music that had lured so many to their doomdod as they sailed closer to the island of the Sirens. Odysseus's heart raced. His men, with their ears sealed tight, rode in silence, their eyes fixed forward. But as they neared the shores of the island, the first notes of the Siren's song drifted across the sea, soft and haunting, like a distant memory. It was impossible to describe in mere words what Odysseus felt in that moment, for their song was more than music. It was a yearning, a longing, a call to something deeper within him. A call that, if he had not been bound by his purpose, he might have followed. The Sirens' voices sang of lost love and adventure, of distant lands and unfulfilled dreams. They spoke of things Odysseus longed for, things that were buried deep within him. His eyes, wide with both fear and fascination, stared toward the distant shore, and for a moment he felt as though he might leap overboard, drawn by the irresistible pull of their voices. His hands gripped the ship's rail, knuckles white. His mind torn between the safety of his crew and the allure of the Siren's promise. But he remembered Circe's warning, and despite the overwhelming temptation, he held firm. He shouted orders to his men, his voice breaking through the haze of his own desire. Faster, row, row, row. His words were a command and a plea, urging them to escape the island, to leave the sweet music behind. The men, with their wax-covered ears, could only row harder, pushing the ship forward with all their might. The Sirens sang louder, their voices rising in intensity, but still Odysseus held strong. And just as the music reached its peak, the ship passed the island, the sound fading into the distance. The crew had survived. Yet, even as they sailed away from the Sirens, their danger was far from over. Ahead, looming like a shadow on the horizon, was a new threat, one that would test their strength and their resolve in ways they could not imagine. This was the point of no return, where even Odysseus's wisdom and cunning would be put to the ultimate test. As they sailed forward, Odysseus turned his gaze toward the rocky cliffs ahead. They were caught between two impossible choices, two dangers that were both unavoidable and catastrophic. On one side lay Scylla, a monstrous creature with 12 legs and 6 heads, each lined with rows of sharp teeth, ever hungry for human flesh. On the other side was Charybdis, a great whirlpool that could swallow ships whole, pulling everything into its depths. The men looked to Odysseus, but he did not hesitate. He had been warned by Circe of the dangers ahead and had made his choice. "We must sail between them," he told his crew, his voice steady. "We must trust in the gods and trust in each other." The ship turned slightly, heading toward the narrow strait between Scylla and Charybdis. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of the wind seemed to hold its breath. Odysseus knew that there was no perfect choice. One monster would claim some of his men, but the other might claim them all. And so he steeled himself for the inevitable, knowing that no matter the outcome, he would lead them through. Scylla struck. First, her heads darted from the cliffs, her jaws snapping shut with terrifying speed. She grabbed 6 men in total, her mouths devouring them before they even had a chance to scream. The rest of the crew watched in horror, helpless as their comrades were lost to the creature. The ship raced forward, the whirlpool of Charybdis looming ever closer. The men, their hearts pounding in their chests, strained at the oars, desperate to escape the grasp of the sea. As the ship sped away from the rocky cliffs, the terrifying sound of Charybdis echoed behind them, the water churning as if the very sea itself was angry. And then, as if guided by some divine force, they were free. The ship emerged from the strait, the monsters fading behind them. The crew, bruised and battered but alive, let out a collective breath. Their journey was far from over, but they had survived another trial, another test of their will and endurance. For Odysseus, however, the cost of survival weighed heavily on his heart. 6 of his men had perished. Their faces lingered in his mind's eye, and though he had saved many, the cost of their lives haunted him. He had made the difficult choice, and in the end, it was the price of leadership. The knowledge that not every decision would be right, and not every sacrifice could be avoided. As they sailed on, Odysseus could not help but wonder what would be the cost of the next trial. How much more could they endure before the gods, or fate itself, would take all from him? The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the turbulent waters. Odysseus and his weary crew sailed onward, leaving behind the horrors of Scylla and Charybdis. Their hearts, though still heavy with loss, carried a renewed sense of purpose. But as with every hero's journey, no matter how many trials they survived, another test always awaited them. And it was in the shadow of a new challenge that Odysseus would face one of his greatest encounters, yet the sorceress Circe. Circe, a goddess of magic and transformation, resided on the island of Aea, a place that seemed to pulse with a mysterious energy. It was said that she could transform men into animals with a mere flick of her hand, an enchantress whose beauty and power were matched only by the danger she posed. But the gods had decreed that Odysseus would meet her, and through his cunning and resolve, he would be forced to confront yet another daunting challenge. As the ship approached the shores of Aea, Odysseus felt a strange sensation tugging at his soul, a quiet whisper from within, as if some unseen force was calling to him, urging him toward the island. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the journey pressing upon him, the burden of leadership heavy in his chest. But despite the fatigue that had settled into his bones and the growing sense of isolation that gnawed at his spirit, Odysseus knew he could not turn away. The journey was far from over, and his resolve would be tested once more. The island of Aea, with its lush forests and tranquil waters, appeared deceptively serene. Yet Odysseus knew better than to be lulled into a false sense of security. He ordered his men to remain vigilant, though their tired eyes betrayed their need for rest. The crew had seen too much, endured too much, to fall prey to the illusion of peace. They landed on the island, and with hesitant steps, Odysseus led his men ashore. The island was silent, the air thick with the scent of wild herbs and the faint echo of distant birdsong. It was a place of strange beauty, but as Odysseus knew all too well, beauty often hid danger. It wasn't long before the men encountered a strange sight. A group of wild animals, tamed yet still primal, lounging around a grand palace in the distance. These animals, who had once been men, moved with an eerie grace, their eyes distant and unseeing. The men were unnerved, their instincts telling them that something was deeply wrong. They had heard the rumors, the stories of those who had crossed Circe and been transformed into beasts, cursed to wander for eternity. With a heavy heart, Odysseus made the decision to send a group of men to investigate the palace, though he remained behind, cautious and unwilling to put himself at further risk. The men, hungry for answers and perhaps too tired to question their orders, ventured toward the grand building, unaware of the fate that awaited them. It was not long before they encountered Circe. She was beautiful, radiant in the golden light of the afternoon, but there was something cold and calculating behind her smile. She welcomed the men into her home, offering them food and drink, but Odysseus had warned them to be wary, to resist any temptations, for he suspected that this was no ordinary goddess. Yet, even with his words in their ears, the men were drawn to her hospitality. They sat, ate, and drank, their exhaustion clouding their judgment. And as predicted, the enchantress worked her magic. One by one, the men were transformed before their very eyes, their bodies shifting into the forms of swine. The men, now mindless and helpless, could only grunt and stumble, the curse of Circe taking hold of them with frightening speed. Odysseus, watching from a distance, felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he knew he could not afford to panic. His men were not beyond saving. His wisdom and cunning would once again be tested. He recalled the warning of Hermes, the messenger god, who had appeared to him in a dream. Hermes had given him the knowledge he needed to resist Circe's magic, a powerful herb called moly, which would protect him from the sorceress's spell. Armed with this gift, Odysseus set off toward the palace, determined to rescue his men. When he reached the grand hall, Circe greeted him with a sly smile, her beauty as alluring as ever. She offered him a drink, but Odysseus, with the moly in hand, resisted. He drank not her potion, but the protection of the gods. The potion had no effect, and Circe's eyes widened in shock. She had not expected this mortal to be immune to her. "Magic, who are you?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with a strange excitement. "I am Odysseus," he replied calmly, his voice steady. "And you have taken my men. I will not leave until they are returned to me." Circe, intrigued by his resistance and impressed by his resolve, did not immediately strike him down as she had others. Instead, she invited him to sit, offering her apologies for her actions. Her eyes studied him intently, as if trying to decipher the secret of his strength. "You are different from the others," she said. "What is it that makes you so immune to my power?" Odysseus, ever the diplomat, did not answer her question directly. Instead, he offered her a deal. If she freed his men and allowed them to continue their journey, he would stay with her for a time, offering his companionship and his wisdom. Circe, after much deliberation, agreed. She released the men from their curse, returning them to their human forms, and the crew was able to continue their journey. But Circe had one last piece of advice for Odysseus. She spoke of the dangers that still lay ahead, of the perils of the underworld, and the need for a greater understanding of the forces that shape the world. She told him that he would soon meet the spirits of the dead, that they would offer him the answers he sought. And in that moment, Odysseus realized that his journey was far from over. He had only just begun to scratch the surface of the truth that lay hidden in the shadows. As they departed from Circe's island, Odysseus looked back one final time, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the road ahead would only grow more treacherous. But he knew that he could face whatever came his way, for he had the strength of the gods on his side and the courage to persevere. He had already overcome so much, and though the journey was long, he would see it through to the end. As the ship sailed farther into the unknown, a new sense of foreboding settled over Odysseus and his men. They had just left Circe's enchanted island, but the advice she gave them rang in Odysseus's ears. They must descend to the underworld to meet the spirit of Tiresias, the blind prophet who would reveal the truths they so desperately sought. The journey was far from over, and now they were to confront the dead, the ancient souls that lingered in the dark, shadowy depths of the earth. It was not a decision Odysseus made lightly. He knew the underworld was a place of danger, a land where the souls of the dead were trapped, wandering in a realm between life and death, forever seeking rest. To enter such a place was to challenge fate itself. Yet, despite the overwhelming fear that gripped his heart, Odysseus was resolute. He had seen enough of the gods' interference in his journey to understand that to ignore this warning would be to risk losing everything. The ship was guided toward the shores of the underworld, where the very air seemed thick with sorrow and the weight of eternity. The waters were still, the horizon shrouded in mist. The crew rowed in silence, each man lost in his thoughts, wondering what lay beyond the dark waters ahead. As they arrived, Odysseus stood at the helm, his heart beating steadily in his chest. This was the final stretch of their journey, and though they had faced unimaginable trials before, the underworld was a new kind of fear. He could already feel the coldness of the land, its stillness creeping into his very bones. The rituals for summoning the spirits were strange, known only to those who understood the ways of the gods. Odysseus, guided by Circe's advice, had prepared the proper offerings, libations of honey and milk, the blood of sacrificed animals, and incense to honor the dead. As the offerings were made, the earth began to tremble. The air grew colder still, and the shadows deepened. The souls of the dead stirred, rising from their graves to join the circle. This scene before Odysseus was one of eerie stillness. Shapes moved in the shadows, their forms barely discernible, but he could feel their presence, could hear the soft whispers of forgotten voices. The souls were trapped in an eternal limbo, neither alive nor truly dead. The very sight of them sent a chill down his spine, but he had a purpose now. He had come to speak with Tiresias, to learn of the god's will and the path he must take. As the ritual unfolded, Odysseus called for Tiresias, his voice calm but firm. The blind prophet emerged from the shadows, his form shrouded in mist, his eyes hidden behind the heavy veil of blindness. He was a figure of ancient wisdom, his body a mere echo of the man he once was. Yet there was something undeniably powerful in his presence, something that suggested the truth he carried was far beyond the mortal realm. Tiresias, Odysseus began, his voice reverberating through the emptiness. I seek your counsel. Tell me, how must I navigate the trials ahead? What must I do to return home? Tiresias's voice, though soft, was filled with an undeniable authority. Odysseus, he said, his tone distant yet clear, your journey is far from over. The gods are fickle, and their will is not always clear. You will face more hardships before you return to your wife, to your kingdom. But know this, you will be tested, and you must remain resolute. Your fate is entwined with the gods, and their anger can be a great force, but so can their favor. Tiresias continued, telling Odysseus of the wrath of Poseidon, who still sought revenge for the blinding of his son, the Cyclops. He warned that the journey home would not be easy, for the gods would throw every obstacle in his path. Yet, despite the trials, Odysseus's destiny was clear. The prophet spoke of the sacrifices Odysseus must make, of the choices that lay ahead, and the way he must choose to bring peace to his kingdom and family. "You will return to Ithaca," Tiresias said, "but the road is long and fraught with dangers. You must resist the temptation to seek vengeance, for that will only lead to more pain. Your ultimate goal is not to conquer, but to restore balance, to rebuild what has been lost." Odysseus listened intently, absorbing the words that flowed from Tiresias like a river of ancient wisdom. The prophet's words were not the simple answers Odysseus had hoped for, but they were a guide, a path forward through the chaos that lay ahead. As the conversation drew to a close, Tiresias's form began to fade into the shadows, his voice a soft whisper in the wind. "Remember, Odysseus," he said, "you are not alone. Even in the depths of the underworld, the gods watch over you, but they will not guide you directly. It is your strength and wisdom that will see you through." With the prophet's words lingering in the air, Odysseus turned away, feeling the weight of his destiny settle over him. The underworld was not a place of answers, but of understanding. He had come seeking a clear path, but what he received was a warning, a reminder that the journey ahead would not be easy. Yet, despite the uncertainty that lay before him, Odysseus felt a sense of resolve growing within him. The choices would be his to make, but he was no longer alone. The gods, the spirits, and the wisdom of Tiresias would guide him. If he was willing to listen, the journey back to the land of the living was a solemn one. Odysseus and his men, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of the trials that awaited them, set sail once more. But as they left the underworld behind, a new understanding began to take root in Odysseus's heart. The gods may be capricious, the journey may be long and fraught with peril, but his strength, his cunning, and his resolve would carry him forward. And so, with the winds in his favor, Odysseus sailed on, knowing that the road ahead was still long, but he would face it with courage. As the wind shifted, guiding the ship toward Ithaca, a sense of anticipation grew within Odysseus. His home, the kingdom he had left behind so many years ago, was now within his grasp. The familiar sight of the rocky shores, the mist hanging low over the land, the whispers of the winds in the trees, it was all there, just as he remembered. Yet, despite the relief that should have come with this sight, there was also an unsettling feeling in his heart. He had been away for so long. Ithaca was no longer the same place he had left. The time of his absence had allowed a great many changes to take root. The palace was filled with suitors who had taken advantage of his absence, each man vying for the hand of his beloved wife, Penelope. These men, while well-intentioned, had no true claim to Ithaca. They were not the true rulers. They were parasites, living off of the land that was rightfully Odysseus's. But Odysseus could not return with his heart full of vengeance. It was not the way of a true king to give in to hatred and rash actions. His mission now was not just to reclaim his throne, but to restore order, to re-establish justice and fairness to his kingdom. His long journey had been one of learning, of understanding what it meant to be a true leader. And this final challenge would test all that he had learned. As he and his men approached the shores, they docked the ship under the cover of darkness. They were cautious, stealthy, and ready for what lay ahead. Odysseus had no intention of confronting the suitors immediately. His first task was to assess the situation, to learn what had happened in his absence. He knew that his return could lead to immediate confrontation, so he had to be patient. He donned the guise of a beggar, a lowly figure whom the suitors would not recognize. He had learned much on his journey, how to hide his true identity, how to use the element of surprise to his advantage. It was a tactic he had employed before, and it had served him well. In this case, it would allow him to gather information without drawing attention to himself. As he approached the palace, he could hear the sounds of revelry spilling out from the hall. The suitors were gathered inside, feasting and celebrating, confident that Penelope would soon choose one of them as her husband. They were unaware that their days of excess would soon come to an end. Odysseus stood at the gates, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment of truth was at hand. He made his way through the halls, unnoticed by the suitors who paid no mind to the beggar at their door. He reached the central courtyard, where he found Penelope sitting quietly, waiting for a decision that had yet to come. She was a woman of great strength, her beauty and wisdom undiminished by the passing years. Even though her heart had been tested by the endless parade of suitors, she had never lost faith. She had held out hope that Odysseus would one day return. Penelope looked up as Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, entered the room. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of warmth, that made her heart skip a beat. Her instincts told her that this man, despite his ragged appearance, was no ordinary beggar. There was a certain familiarity to him, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. She had not seen Odysseus for so many years, but she still remembered the love they shared, the strength of their bond. She approached him slowly, her gaze soft, yet sharp. "Who are you, stranger?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "And what brings you to our house?" Odysseus, still in disguise, responded in a humble tone, "I am but a beggar, my lady. I have traveled far and long, and I ask only for a morsel of food and shelter for the night." Penelope studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. She motioned for him to sit, offering him food and drink. As he ate, they exchanged pleasantries, but there was an underlying tension between them. Penelope had been tested by so many suitors over the years, each one more insistent than the last. Yet, in her heart, she had never lost the hope that Odysseus would return, and that hope was what kept her grounded. Meanwhile, the suitors continued their feast, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding just outside their reach. They mocked Odysseus, calling him a foolish beggar, believing him to be nothing more than a beggar passing through. They had no idea that the man they laughed at was the very king they had all hoped to dethrone. As the night wore on, the tension in the room grew. Penelope, ever the gracious hostess, had prepared a test for the suitors. She had promised to choose a husband only after a contest, a test that would prove who was worthy of her hand. She brought out the great bow of Odysseus, the weapon that only he could string, and she presented it to the suitors. "Whoever can string this bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads will be my husband," she declared. The suitors attempted to string the bow, each failing miserably. Their strength was no match for the task at hand, and soon their confidence began to wane. One by one they failed, and Odysseus, still in disguise, stepped forward with a calmness that came from years of experience. He took the bow in his hands. The suitors watched, some jeering, others anxious. but all of them unaware of the true identity of the man who held the weapon. Odysseus effortlessly strung the bow, his hands steady as he took aim. The room fell silent as he released the arrow, sending it through all 12 axe heads with a precision that only a true master could achieve. The suitors gasped, their disbelief palpable. Penelope's eyes widened in recognition as she watched the man before her, the man who had returned, not as a beggar, but as the king of Ithaca. With a nod of approval, Odysseus revealed his true identity, his disguise falling away like a mask. The suitors, now realizing their mistake, recoiled in shock and fear. The time for games was over. The long-awaited return had come, and with it, the reckoning for those who had overstayed there. Welcome in Ithaca. The confrontation was swift. The suitors, no longer able to hide behind their arrogance, tried to flee or defend themselves, but they were no match for Odysseus and his loyal servants. The room was filled with the sounds of chaos, the clash of swords, and the cries of men who had once thought themselves invincible. In the end, Odysseus stood victorious. The palace was quiet once more, and the suitors were no more. His home had been reclaimed, his kingdom restored. But despite the sense of triumph that should have filled his heart, Odysseus felt a weight settle upon him. The victory was not without its cost. Many lives had been lost, and the peace he had so longed for had come at a price. As he turned to Penelope, his heart filled with both joy and sorrow. They had been reunited, but the journey had been long, and the road had been fraught with hardships. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Odysseus realized that he had learned something invaluable. It was not the victory or the conquest that made a king, but the ability to restore balance, to bring peace to his people, and to cherish the ones he loved. With Penelope by his side, Odysseus had returned not just to his home, but to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly home. The journey had been long, but in the end, it was the love and the strength of his family that had guided him through it all. As the wind shifted, guiding the ship toward Ithaca, a sense of anticipation grew within Odysseus. His home, the kingdom he had left behind so many years ago, was now within his grasp. The familiar sight of the rocky shores, the mist hanging low over the land, the whispers of the winds in the trees, it was all there, just as he remembered. Yet, despite the relief that should have come with this sight, there was also an unsettling feeling in his heart. He had been away for so long. Ithaca was no longer the same place he had left. The time of his absence had allowed a great many changes to take root. The palace was filled with suitors who had taken advantage of his absence, each man vying for the hand of his beloved wife, Penelope. These men, while well-intentioned, had no true claim to Ithaca. They were not the true rulers. They were parasites, living off of the land that was rightfully Odysseus's. But Odysseus could not return with his heart full of vengeance. It was not the way of a true king to give in to hatred and rash actions. His mission now was not just to reclaim his throne, but to restore order, to re-establish justice and fairness to his kingdom. His long journey had been one of learning, of understanding what it meant to be a true leader. And this final challenge would test all that he had learned. As he and his men approached the shores, they docked the ship under the cover of darkness. They were cautious, stealthy, and ready for what lay ahead. Odysseus had no intention of confronting the suitors immediately. His first task was to assess the situation, to learn what had happened in his absence. He knew that his return could lead to immediate confrontation, so he had to be patient. He donned the guise of a beggar, a lowly figure whom the suitors would not recognize. He had learned much on his journey, how to hide his true identity, how to use the element of surprise to his advantage. It was a tactic he had employed before, and it had served him well. In this case, it would allow him to gather information without drawing attention to himself. As he approached the palace, he could hear the sounds of revelry spilling out from the hall. The suitors were gathered inside, feasting and celebrating, confident that Penelope would soon choose one of them as her husband. They were unaware that their days of excess would soon come to an end. Odysseus stood at the gates, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment of truth was at hand. He made his way through the halls, unnoticed by the suitors who paid no mind to the beggar at their door. He reached the central courtyard, where he found Penelope sitting quietly, waiting for a decision that had yet to come. She was a woman of great strength, her beauty and wisdom undiminished by the passing years. Even though her heart had been tested by the endless parade of suitors, she had never lost faith. She had held out hope that Odysseus would one day return. Penelope looked up as Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, entered the room. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of warmth, that made her heart skip a beat. Her instincts told her that this man, despite his ragged appearance, was no ordinary beggar. There was a certain familiarity to him, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. She had not seen Odysseus for so many years, but she still remembered the love they shared, the strength of their bond. She approached him slowly, her gaze soft, yet sharp. "Who are you, stranger?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "And what brings you to our house?" Odysseus, still in disguise, responded in a humble tone. "I am but a beggar, my lady. I have traveled far and long, and I ask only for a morsel of food and shelter for the night." Penelope studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. She motioned for him to sit, offering him food and drink. As he ate, they exchanged pleasantries, but there was an underlying tension between them. Penelope had been tested by so many suitors over the years, each one more insistent than the last. Yet, in her heart, she had never lost the hope that Odysseus would return, and that hope was what kept her grounded. Meanwhile, the suitors continued their feast, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding just outside their reach. They mocked Odysseus, calling him a foolish beggar, believing him to be nothing more than a beggar passing through. They had no idea that the man they laughed at was the very king they had all hoped to dethrone. As the night wore on, the tension in the room grew. Penelope, ever the gracious hostess, had prepared a test for the suitors. She had promised to choose a husband only after a contest, a test that would prove who was worthy of her hand. She brought out the great bow of Odysseus, the weapon that only he could string, and she presented it to the suitors. "Whoever can string this bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads will be my husband," she declared. The suitors attempted to string the bow, each failing miserably. Their strength was no match for the task at hand, and soon their confidence began to wane. One by one they failed, and Odysseus, still in disguise, stepped forward with a calmness that came from years of experience. He took the bow in his hands. The suitors watched, some jeering, others anxious, but all of them unaware of the true identity of the man who held the weapon. Odysseus effortlessly strung the bow, his hands steady as he took aim. The room fell silent as he released the arrow, sending it through all 12 axe heads with a precision that only a true master could achieve. The suitors gasped, their disbelief palpable. Penelope's eyes widened in recognition as she watched the man before her, the man who had returned, not as a beggar, but as the king of Ithaca. With a nod of approval, Odysseus revealed his true identity, his disguise falling away like a mask. The suitors, now realizing their mistake, recoiled in shock and fear. The time for games was over. The long-awaited return had come, and with it, the reckoning for those who had overstayed there. Welcome in Ithaca. The confrontation was swift. The suitors, no longer able to hide behind their arrogance, tried to flee or defend themselves, but they were no match for Odysseus and his loyal servants. The room was filled with the sounds of chaos, the clash of swords, and the cries of men who had once thought themselves invincible. In the end, Odysseus stood victorious. The palace was quiet once more, and the suitors were no more. His home had been reclaimed, his kingdom restored. But despite the sense of triumph that should have filled his heart, Odysseus felt a weight settle upon him. The victory was not without its cost. Many lives had been lost, and the peace he had so longed for had come at a price. As he turned to Penelope, his heart filled with both joy and sorrow. They had been reunited, but the journey had been long, and the road had been fraught with hardships. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Odysseus realized that he had learned something invaluable. It was not the victory or the conquest that made a king, but the ability to restore balance, to bring peace to his people, and to cherish the ones he loved. With Penelope by his side, Odysseus had returned not just to his home, but to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly home. The journey had been long, but in the end, it was the love and the strength of his family that had guided him through it all.